All right, so welcome back to The Young Idealist in my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today I have a very special guest. We'll be talking about Jürgen Habermas. And today I have Dr. Peter Verovšek, who is an assistant professor in history and theory of European integration at Groningen University, where he teaches in the fields of political science, international relations, and philosophy. Dr. Verovšek expertise is in European integration, memory studies, contemporary continental political philosophy, 20th century intellectual history. And he's also the book reviews editor for Contemporary Political Theory and the author, and this is why I have invited him here, of the recent text, there it is, of Jürgen Habermas, public intellectual, engaged critical theorist from Columbia University Press, which just came out, right? March 26, 2026. So congratulations on your text, and hopefully we'll have some nice points we can bring up and speak about your work.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation, Christopher. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It's been hard to find someone to talk about Habermas's project. And when I saw your text, I was like, this is a perfect opportunity to speak with someone that appreciates his work. Um, so maybe we can start off with a very introductory question. Who was Jürgen Habermas, and why is his thought important for today's contemporary world?
So Jürgen Habermas, I think, is by almost any reckoning one of the most important philosophers of the post-war era, if not the most important. So the period after 1945. Um, there's Cass Sunshine tells a story about speaking with John Rawls, and Rawls sort of asking him a rhetorical question about who he thought was the greatest thinker about democracy in the 20th century, and Sunstein sort of tells the story of him sort of hesitating and not being sure what to say, and then Rawls saying, yes, it's Jürgen Habermas. So I think Habermas in that sense, right, is a really crucial figure in thinking about democracy, particularly in thinking about deliberative democracy. So in this move that I think both in academic circles, but even in sort of more popular in the popular general public, this idea that it's somehow democracy is more than just voting, but it's about the quality of debate in the public sphere. That's a very Habermasian idea, the very idea of the public sphere that we hear so much about now. It's not necessarily a term that he coined as such, but I think it's a term that he really helped to popularize and to sort of really give a philosophical framework to in terms of thinking about why the public sphere is important. I think he's also one of the most important thinkers in terms of really thinking about what it means to come to terms with the dark aspects of your past, right? And for him, as a German born in 1929, who grew up under the Third Reich, it really was that moment in 1945 of realizing that he had grown up in a criminal regime and what that meant. So I think that those are kind of really sort of some of the key factors for him. He's one of, I think, the real progenitors of what is often called the communicative turn, right? So this idea that I think most of your listeners are who are more familiar with philosophy will have heard of the linguistic turn, right? This idea that we have to pay attention to grammar and language in terms of shaping how we think and our in terms of shaping philosophy. And the communicative turn, in some sense, goes a step further and really highlights the importance of not only linguistic structures and grammar, but actually the content of that communication and how sort of the content of what we are trying to say to each other really grounds social interaction. And for Habermas, that is the ground for what he calls communicative action, right? That action essentially is not something that happens in the world, but is something that happens between human beings. So those, I think, all are kind of really key ideas. And in terms of why he's important for us today, I think that in addition to just the importance of those ideas, especially at a time of democratic regression, I think what's really interesting and important about Habermas's thought is that Habermas, I think in many ways, bridges the divide between realism and idealism. And in that sense, I think sort of he really, even in his first book, Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which I think we may talk about a little bit more later, what he really provides there that's interesting and that contrasts, I think, to so many other big philosophical treatises, is that he grounds the idea of the public sphere historically and sort of creates, is able to sort of provide a normative account of a kind of idealized conception of the public sphere. So he gives us those kind of constructive philosophical tools at the normative level. But then at the second half of that book, he also then provides almost a diagnosis of the times and is able to use that normative concept that he develops and grounds historically to also critique the present, right? So I think it's that balance that he has between facts and norms. That's the title of one of his later books, right? So sort of between the way the world is and the way it could or should be, or between realism and idealism, that really gives his thought a lot of power, in the sense that he gives us tools both to think about how things should be and to sort of trace out perhaps why they are not that way and what sort of some of the underlying causes might be. So I think that ability to diagnose, but also to give us ways out of that diagnosis, I think is really important. In that sense, I think Habermas goes a step further than someone like Foucault, Michel Foucault, who gives us really powerful ways to diagnose sort of hidden forms of power, but really gives us no way out of that situation. Whereas I think Habermas gives us both that diagnostic aspect that we get in someone like Foucault, but also then gives us this perhaps more idealist or constructivist aspect that helps us to maybe think about possible ways out, or at least to think about constructively about what kinds of things we might want to look for to get past the problems of the present. So I think that was hopefully not too long an answer, but I think in brief, the concepts and then this approach between facts and norms, or between realism and idealism, I think those are some of the key reasons why Habermas is still very much relevant to us in the present.
No, I think what you did was fantastic. That was a great answer. And it's great to get insight from specialists on the field, so or in the field, sorry. So could you give us a brief biography of Habermas's life? It doesn't have to be too in-depth, but perhaps just covering the main events.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about Habermas's life is that as a German, sort of living in the 20th century, I think he really experienced many of the kind of key events that shape our world today in a really direct manner, right? So as I think I mentioned before, he was born in 1929. He grows up in a family that consists not of sort of rabid anti-Semites or racists, but of sort of typical bourgeois middle-class family that kind of makes its peace with the Nazi regime. His father joins the party, as would have been expected of someone who worked in public administration. Habermas and his brothers join sort of the Hitler Youth. And Habermas, sort of in the waning days of the war, narrowly actually avoids getting drafted into the Homeland Defense. He tells the story that when the draft officers came by, that he was away that evening, and that then a few days later the Americans arrived, and he even sort of adds, "Thank God," right? That he managed to sort of avoid that. And then I think his life is really shaped in the aftermath of that by his experiences, both reading newspapers, but also going to sort of theaters and really seeing firsthand the news programs that were produced in theaters in Germany after 1945 that really revealed kind of the things that had happened in the Third Reich that perhaps some people had known about or had been sort of in the background, but that's a young person like him who had just been going to school really wouldn't have been able to realize. And I think that is really a key moment for Habermas, is this realization that he had grown up in a criminal regime, this realization that sort of a lot of the traditions in Germany that he had grown up with, both cultural but also intellectual, that sort of everything had to be examined anew. And that this was really something that required a kind of fundamental reorientation and a kind of self-criticism that I think really guided his thought for the rest of his life. Habermas had, as a child, sort of often thought about pursuing a career in medicine. But precisely as a result of this experience in 1945 and his political interests, he decides to study philosophy, right? He is actually initially very much taken with existentialism, and in particular the thought of Martin Heidegger, as a way to try to understand, to try to come to grips with what it means to live an authentic life, what his experiences meant. So he ultimately pursues his studies. He writes his dissertation on Schelling. And I think sort of the first really important place at which he sort of breaks into the German public sphere and starts to make a name for himself is as a PhD student. In 1953, one of his friends, another sort of relatively famous 20th century German philosopher, Karl Otto Appel, hands him a copy of Heidegger's newly reprinted 1935 lectures on metaphysics. And in those lectures, Heidegger had republished them without sort of crossing out or taking out a reference to the inner truth and greatness of the National Socialist movement. And Habermas is really taken aback by this. And this really kind of opens up to him the realization of how many German intellectuals, including some of his teachers, had really sort of gone along with the Third Reich and had been, at the very least, fellow travelers, if not active supporters of it. And he ends up writing a very critical article of Heidegger, not as a philosopher, but of Heidegger as a political personality, and basically saying that philosophers have to be aware of the effect that their ideas have on young students and have on the public at large. And I think that already signals sort of his desire to bring his political and his philosophical interests together in a certain way. So in the aftermath of that, Habermas does complete his PhD, but is very disillusioned. And he decides to sort of become a freelance journalist. And he's writing a lot of kind of social commentaries and trying to sort of connect his philosophical and his political interests, which he didn't think he could do in post-war German academia. He does that for a few years. And through that process, he comes to the attention of Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno. So one of the sort of most famous figures in the first generation of critical theory. Adorno had recently returned to Germany after being in exile, but for the longest period in the United States. Habermas is encouraged to contact Adorno by one of his editors at a newspaper, and that begins Habermas's association with the Frankfurt School, so with critical theory, and he's often now seen as the second generation of critical theory. He spends time there, and there he really finds not only a way to kind of bring together his philosophical and his political interests, something that he'd found impossible before, because so many post-war German philosophers sort of avoided social theory and political theory because they didn't want to have to talk about what they had done during the war. Whereas Adorno sort of really encouraged that, and Habermas found that very liberating. And he also found it very liberating to be exposed to a tradition of thought that was not associated with the Third Reich, that in fact had opposed the Third Reich and the Nazi movement from the beginning. And he discovered this kind of Jewish tradition of German thought, especially in figures like Walter Benjamin, in early critical theory, and really with his deep engagement with Marx at the time. Right? So he finds this alternate tradition that is, in some sense, untainted by National Socialism, and that is really important to him. So I think that's sort of his early life that I think really shapes him. He then ultimately ends up having to leave the Frankfurt School, or leave Frankfurt in general, because Max Horkheimer, who was the director of the Institute as sort of the other main figure at this period alongside Adorno, was very skeptical of Habermas and saw him as too left-wing, saw him as dangerous, and almost feared that Habermas, with his kind of turn to Marx, was actually acting as an apologist to what Horkheimer called the gentleman from the East, so for actually existing communism in the Eastern Bloc. And so Habermas is then forced to take Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which I mentioned before, his first book, which is also his habilitation, so this kind of second dissertation that German academics have to write in order to become eligible for professorships. He then has to find a different professor to sponsor him. And he ultimately is able to find that in Marburg with Wolfgang Abendroth, who is a political scientist and is actually the only Marxist, explicitly Marxist political scientist in post-war Germany at the time. And after publishing that volume, Habermas rather unexpectedly, almost immediately, is called, and that's literally what the Germans call it when you are offered a professorship. It's a Ruf, so a calling, is called to an extraordinary professorship at the University of Heidelberg by Hans-Georg Gadamer. And I think that's a really surprising kind of connection. And we usually think of Gadamer as kind of a more conservative thinker. But Gadamer was familiar with Habermas's work because he was the editor of a journal and had asked Habermas to write a literature review on Marxism. And Gadamer really appreciated the fact that Habermas approached Marxism not as sort of as an avowed communist or an opponent of communism, but really as someone who was interested in learning from Marx and sort of trying to see what aspects of Marxism could sort of constructively be used for the present. Habermas then goes on to sort of have to return to Frankfurt after Horkheimer retires. Actually blesses Habermas taking up his old professorship after he leaves. So Horkheimer had changed his opinion, and Habermas is in Frankfurt and is one of the leaders, intellectual leaders or allies of the student movement that kind of culminates in 1968. But Habermas at that point, he also has a famous break with the student movement. Although he supported them, he becomes very worried by the student movement's proximity to kind of Maoism and to this idea that they could almost create a revolutionary situation out of thin air. And Habermas is very worried about the idea of revolution. He prefers what he calls a kind of radical reformism. And so Habermas really sort of worries that the students are always going too far and are not aware of actually the democratic potential and the fact that the post-war Federal Republic actually really has the potential to achieve a lot of their aims without revolution, so without violence. In the aftermath of his break with the students and Adorno's death, Habermas decides to leave Frankfurt and he takes up a research position at the Max Planck Institute in Starnberg, a very kind of rich suburb of Munich. And he spends 10 years there at an institute that is devoted to sort of examining how life has changed under conditions of scientific and technical rationality. And during his time there, he writes what is often seen as his main opus of social theory, the theory of communicative action, where he really lays out this idea of communication as the underlying thing that separates kind of human beings and human societies from other animals, but also really serves as the foundation for society. He then, in 1983, returns to Frankfurt and works as a professor there. And through the 1980s, he returns to sort of issues of political theory. He's involved in the famous Historikerstreit, so the historians' debate about the meaning of Nazism for Germany, and kind of opposing the conservative government that wants to normalize German foreign policy. In 1990, he's very active in the debates about the reunification of Germany, which he initially opposes. He thinks that sort of Germany, if it's going to unify, that it should only unify after a kind of plebiscite in a full constitutional convention that would make both sides, East and West, equals, rather than simply absorbing the East into the West, which he sees as almost a kind of colonial maneuver. And after the reunification of Germany, he increasingly becomes interested in the European Union. And that interest really, I think, comes out of two kind of political worries that he has. The first is his worry about what this means that this kind of reactivates what's traditionally called the German problem. So a unified, powerful Germany in the middle of Europe, right, has always caused problems throughout history. And Habermas starts to see the European Union as a way of anchoring Germany and making it less dangerous to its neighbors. Right, so that's the kind of internal reason. And then externally in the 1990s, Habermas is increasingly becoming worried about globalization and neoliberalism. And on one level, he appreciates the kind of functional advantages of neoliberalism and the kind of interconnections that it can forge throughout the world. But he's becoming increasingly worried that as a result of globalization, the sort of multinational corporations and international financial markets are unifying at the global level in a way that really allows them to sort of take advantage of a politics that is still rooted in the nation state, and that sort of these global markets can sort of force nation states to kind of do whatever they want, or can sort of almost spur a kind of race to the bottom between nation states, right, who are searching for foreign direct investment and things like that. So Habermas also sees the European Union, in addition to being an anchor for Germany, he sees the European Union as a way of sort of bringing up politics to a supranational level where it can sort of compete or catch up to and stand up to global markets and international kind of financial forces. And that really sort of shapes his support for the European Union that we see sort of through the early 2000s, 2010s. In 1994, he actually retires, but maintains is still very active, both as a philosopher and as a kind of public intellectual, writing about various issues of the day. And he continues that activity up until his death on March 14th, which I think very appropriately was also the 150th 43rd anniversary of Marx's death. So I think in that sense, there's a real appropriateness to kind of the time he passed away. And I think the only other thing I'll say is that it's sort of, there's a kind of almost tragedy about Habermas's passing, in the sense that in his final years, he had, with the sort of return of war to Europe, with increasingly sort of this, what was this decline of liberal democracy, the decline of democracy more generally, and sort of a pushback against international law, Habermas really felt that a lot of the kind of things that he had worked a lot of his life to oppose and to work against were kind of coming back, and that in some sense, sort of everything that he had philosophically and politically worked to bring about was being lost step by step. So I think there is a kind of tragic dimension to his death, and to sort of his death in the contemporary moment as well.
I think you did a really fantastic job of giving such a well-rounded and very balanced image of Habermas. So I can't thank you enough. You had brought up Habermas's kind of disillusionment with the Frankfurt School. So this may be maybe we can go a little more in depth in it. But what made Habermas become disillusioned with the Frankfurt School and maybe with critical theory?
Mm. I mean, I think disillusion may be a little bit strong. I think he always had a very complicated relationship to critical theory and to this idea that he was seen as kind of the second generation of the Frankfurt School. In particular, I think that a lot of his critics use that positioning to kind of say that he was not a true heir to the Frankfurt School, in the sense that he did not do his PhD with Horkheimer and Adorno, right, or in that tradition, and that he in some sense had betrayed that tradition. Whereas I think Habermas really felt that traditions that survive also have to change, right? That sort of, you can't only be sort of trapped in orthodoxy. But I think sort of part of his disillusionment was clearly due to his personal and philosophical disagreements with Horkheimer and Horkheimer's attempt to almost end his career in 1958, 1959, when he sort of rejected structural transformation as Habermas's habilitation. I think Habermas was also somewhat disillusioned with critical theory, because critical theory in the 1930s really had started out with this ambition to bring together theory and practice, and to sort of revive, or for the first time to really bring to fruition or to fulfill Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, right, about philosophers not only understanding the world, but actively changing it. And I think Habermas, like many other people, actually felt that over the course of the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, that critical theory had really abandoned that sort of practical orientation, and had increasingly sort of fallen into a kind of philosophical negativism, right? And the negativism that we see in Adorno's mature philosophy, right? In his sort of negativistic critical theory. And certainly I think sort of scholars more recently have tried to sort of point out that Adorno, that it is possible to pull out more positive contributions from Adorno's thought. But Habermas really thought that you needed to, that it in some sense in that, I guess, relationship between critique and constructivism, or between facts and norms, between the real and the ideal, that the first generation had almost gone too far down the realist or negatively diagnostic route, and hadn't retained enough of that idealism. And so he was really, in that sense, searching for new foundations for critical theory. And that's, I think, where he really comes around to the idea of linguistic philosophy and philosophy of language as a possible space where he could take a lot of the initial impulses of critical theory and even some of its thoughts and concepts, and could sort of put them onto both a firmer foundation, but also a foundation that would allow him to really reconstruct this practical orientation in a way that could really work, and most notably in a way that could work within kind of the structures of democracy that the post-war world was really defined by, right? And I think that's really what the public sphere is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be a sphere for rational debate, but not a sphere of rational debate just among thinkers, but a sphere of rational debate that was supposed to be connected to actual political decision making through kind of the pressure that the public sphere is able to exert on politicians and on political institutions to sort of pay attention and to sort of, I guess, transform what Habermas calls the opinion formation that occurs in the public sphere into actual will formation, so into actual sort of administrative enforceable law that then happens through kind of the institutional mechanisms of democracy. So I think in that sense, Habermas really saw himself as fulfilling a lot of the impulses of critical theory, albeit sort of based on kind of different foundations. So I think in that sense, there was always a complicated aspect to that relationship. And Habermas, I think, in many ways often felt burdened by being seen as sort of the next generation of critical theory, and almost felt that it was people trying to deny him his intellectual liberty to be able to develop his own philosophical ideas, instead of, whereas other people were saying, oh, no, you just have to keep developing Adorno's negativism, which Habermas really felt was, in some sense, which he both appreciated, but also in some sense felt was something of a limited approach, if not kind of a dead end.
Thank you for that. I see, in the title of your book, it's, engaged critical theorist. So I'm I'm assuming that you see him as a critical theorist straight through his entire oeuvre or his entire body of work. Is it I always thought of him as, well, I always thought of the public sphere as what Kant was saying in What is Enlightenment, this idea of the practice of public reason. I always saw him as now I could definitely be wrong about this, kind of bridging the gap between Kant and Marx. That's how I saw Habermas in some sense. Maybe you can clear up my confusion with what is the public sphere in Habermas's thought, and what is the democratic dimension to his thinking in this era of his thought.
No, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I think sort of seeing the public sphere as a way of linking Kant to Marx, I think is actually sort of a really good way of understanding it. And to go into a little bit more detail, I think the public sphere, yeah, it really is about this idea that men of learning have an obligation in the public to sort of speak their minds and to sort of exchange thoughts with each other, and that is a way of sort of not only kind of reaching the truth within kind of philosophical or scientific discussion, but also a kind of way for individuals to both monitor and supervise and criticize the public administration, right? To criticize the state. And Habermas, historically, in structural transformation of the public sphere, he really roots the ideal of the public sphere in the kind of bourgeois era, so in the 17th and 18th century, in the kind of salon culture of France or the coffee houses of Britain, where you see kind of individuals from different social classes, so merchants, artisans, members of the nobility, members of the state bureaucracy, so people who previously wouldn't have had contact with each other, coming together to discuss issues of mutual interest, so whether that's literature, whether it's art, whether it's politics, whether it's sort of economics and their kind of burgeoning financial interests, right? Again, this is also, on a negative level, the time of European colonialism and imperialism, but also a time of the beginning of capitalism, which Habermas, in some sense, sees. He's obviously critical of capitalism, but he also sees it as a positive, because capitalism and the growing financial interests of individuals abroad means that they really have to take an interest in politics, which previously had only been of interest to and was seen as the affair of the court around the king. Whereas sort of having financial interests, the rise of companies, the rise of shareholders, it means all of a sudden that whole new classes of individuals care about what is happening elsewhere, care about foreign policy, right? And all of a sudden really take an interest in politics beyond just issues of war and peace and whether they're going to get drafted and have to fight. And he really sees that as the origin of not only this idea that the public can hold the sovereign to account, but also of a whole new conception of humanity, where individuals who previously would not have seen themselves as part of a common public really see themselves as equals and as having a common interest in politics. Um, and so in that sense, I think it's important to remember, right, that previously, right, there were different laws that applied to a member of the nobility than to commoners. And really, he sees the public sphere in this period as being important to sort of breaking down those barriers. And so that's really, I think, sort of the role that it plays. And in that sense, you could see the kind of fusion of Kant, right? This idea that the public sphere is expressing this idea of individuals increasingly coming to sort of reject their tutelage, right? And sort of being able to speak their own mind and reason for themselves. But also there's this Marxist awareness of kind of the sociological background conditions for this to come about, right? So just people have the caffeinated beverages together is not enough, right? You have to have the rise of early capitalism. You have to have all these other conditions in place for individuals to take an interest in politics and to actually, and for the sovereign to increasingly be dependent on tax income, right? And thus having to care about what people think. And so that, I think, you do see the fusion of Kant and Marx there. And I think also you see the fusion of Kant and Marx in this desire to be able to develop conceptions that can both be used for diagnosis, but also that can be used to sort of try to think our way out of situations, right? And to not only see, sort of realize what's wrong with the present, but to sort of try to conceptualize how we might do better, right? Or sort of how we might overcome the crises of the present or the pathologies of the present, to use language that is very much associated with the Frankfurt School.
What was the role of public intellectual to Habermas, and why might they play an important role in modern societies? And I see this is probably an important element in your book, right? The public intellectual engage critical theorists. So maybe we can also discuss some aspects of your book as well, too.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think sort of in terms of my book, I think what really sets it apart from other biographies of Habermas, and there have been a couple of excellent ones, is really that I focus on his work as a public intellectual. And the idea of a public intellectual is really supposed to capture this desire that Habermas has to not be a kind of philosopher of the ivory tower, but sort of actually engage in real world debates and to sort of use his very privileged position as a philosopher, right, who has a sort of steady income and who does not have to engage in debates and does not sort of depend on engagement in debates in the way that journalists or commentators, or today we would talk about influencers, right, who have to have an opinion on everything, right, who have to react to every new piece of news. Habermas really sees the role of the public intellectual as being someone who has the security, usually of an academic position, and who is used to sort of thinking about the big picture and has kind of both the financial freedom, but also, I guess, the reputational freedom to not have to worry about what people think about them, what people will say about them, and can almost undertake this role as being almost kind of a Socratic gadfly in the contemporary democratic public sphere to sort of really draw attention to kind of silences or to sort of issues that are important that are not being thematized, or to sort of voices and perspectives that are not being given their due, or to arguments in contemporary debates that sort of we should pay more attention to, right? To good arguments that are not being heard. And he really sees in that sense the public intellectual as being someone who is able to intervene and almost ensure that public democratic discourse in the public sphere is of as high quality as possible, right? So in some sense, the public intellectual is a kind of guardian of the public sphere and tries to ensure that the public sphere works as well as it can. And importantly for Habermas, the public intellectual is not someone whose arguments should be treated as authoritative, right? So I mean, if you look at other forms of philosophy or other approaches, philosophical approaches to interaction with the public, you often see people, especially kind of the Anglosphere or in what's often referred to as analytic philosophy, talk about what philosophers can really bring to public debate is sort of their analytic toolbox and their sort of expertise in dealing with normative arguments and helping people to see sort of what the best normative arguments are. And for Habermas, that's really not what the public intellectual is supposed to do. He doesn't think that there should be this kind of idea that certain people are just better argumenters and that they're voices should have more weight. He often says that in the public sphere, there are only participants, right? So the public intellectual has a certain freedom and is able to intervene and sort of tries to elevate voices and perspectives that deserve more attention, but ultimately claims no kind of special authority, right? Ultimately, the public intellectuals, fellow citizens, decide what perspectives they're going to go with, or sort of whether they're going to listen. And I think Habermas himself, throughout his career as a public intellectual, was often sort of a central player, not so much because he ultimately convinced his fellow citizens in Germany or in Europe of his perspectives, but because he was very successful in kind of at least forcing people to confront arguments and perspectives that they previously hadn't. And so he, in that sense, was a very good instigator, and perhaps not as good as a convincer of his fellow citizens that he might have wanted to be. But I really see the public intellectual as being kind of this role that he had as being kind of central and overlooked. And so one of the key critiques we often see of Habermas is that that his conception of communication and of the way language works, that it's modeled on a university seminar, and that he's just kind of a liberal who has no conception of how real politics works. And I really think that that is a misreading and a misunderstanding of his work that either ignores kind of his work as a public intellectual or overlooks the way his work as a public intellectual is consistent with his theoretical positioning, right? So it's also a way that his work as a public intellectual, I think you could see as his attempt to almost put his theory into practice. And I think that that is often overlooked in a lot of the scholarship, in part because a lot of his interventions as a public intellectual for most of his career before 1990 were really about Germany. A lot of them weren't translated. So I think in that sense, there are a lot of these texts that aren't really well known. A lot of the texts that he wrote as a public intellectual, when they're translated, it's also not necessarily clear that they are kind of public works or sort of these kind of public interventions. They're also often just translated and put into collections of his essay without any kind of note that would make people aware of that. And so I think that sort of what my book is really trying to do is to shed light on this and to sort of highlight the breadth and depth of his engagement, and also then to say that look at this consistency, and you may disagree with Habermas, you may sort of think that his positions are wrong or naive, but you can't say that he has an idealized version of the public sphere, right? He's very much aware. He talks about sort of public discourse as being kind of acidic and burning all who participate. He often says that sort of he would have had a much easier life if he had just sort of worked as a philosopher and sort of stayed in the ivory tower. But instead, he really chooses to engage and sort of talks about the public sphere not as a kind of university seminar, but as a kind of chaotic sphere, a wild sphere, right, where all arguments should be allowed to be put forth, and where individuals should be allowed to really engage in rhetoric as well. So in that sense, I think the book is really driven by an attempt to sort of really pull out or highlight this, I think, often overlooked aspect of his thought, and to really show that Habermas was a political actor, and that his political convictions both shaped his theory, but were also shaped by his theory, and to almost highlight that kind of interaction between theory and practice that I think really helps us to gain a new perspective on his work.
I have one more question. I always find this fascinating when a philosopher or an academic writes an actual book on one particular figure, um, and I'm looking really forward to reading your text. What brought you to Habermas, number one? And then what also brought you to, as you said, there have been multiple biographies on Habermas. What made you write this text?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I've given you a lot of the kind of the academic background and the kind of gap in the literature that I saw. But obviously, any decision, right? And I think sort of as academics, our choices of what to research are always connected to our biographies in some way or to our interests. And I think sort of my connection to Habermas, um, I think really started when I was an undergraduate. So I was fortunate to go to Dartmouth College, and I encountered Habermas, and I studied political science and German there, but I also took a bunch of classes in the philosophy department. And at the time, the philosophy department there was very, very analytic, but there was one continental philosopher who was giving classes there, Amy Allen. And I basically, when I was there, took all her classes. And in her class on um, 20th century European philosophy, continental philosophy, she actually taught the class using Habermas's philosophical discourse of modernity, right? This famous lecture series he gave in the 1980s, where he positioned himself sort of vis-a-vis all of the important thinkers of his age, in particular, right? People like Derrida, like Foucault. And so what she did was she actually structured the class where we would read some Foucault and then we would read Habermas's response. And I always found myself very attracted to what Habermas was saying. I thought that sort of his attempts to kind of never to completely reject a thinker, but to take what they were saying and sort of translate it into his own terms and to try to learn something from them while not being constrained completely by their ideas. I always found that very productive. Also, sort of as someone who came from Slovenia, right, so from Central Europe, who sort of experienced 1989 as sort of someone young, and who was very interested in the EU. I was very attracted to Habermas's, also to his politics and to his support of the EU, and to his worries about globalization. So in that sense, I thought that I had found in him a way of thinking about the present and almost a vocabulary for myself to understand what was happening. And that sort of translated into my PhD research. And actually, my first academic article came out of a seminar paper that I wrote. It was a seminar that I took at Yale Law School that was co-taught by my advisor at the political science department, Shayla Ben-Habib. And that paper was actually looking at his sort of interventions as a public intellectual on the European Union and sort of tracing out how they had changed over time and sort of what he was doing. And so that was my kind of my first academic paper coming out of that sort of seminar paper that I wrote. And so I had this interest for a while. I ended up writing my dissertation on the EU and memory politics. And then I really came back to this idea. And it was while I was working as a young academic at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And Sheffield has a couple of very prominent people, representatives of what's often called political realism, right? So this sort of strand of political theory that really says that political theory should really be speaking to real politics in a more substantive way. And in my conversations with them, I often found myself making these points about, no, Habermas is not an idealist. He is a realist, right? He's very involved in real politics. And it seemed that sort of, despite the fact that they often critiqued Habermas, that my colleagues were very much unaware of this, right? So that almost really pushed me to sort of come back to this idea that I already had initially and sort of revive it and ultimately to write my second book on it. So I think Habermas for me, from the kind of beginning of my real philosophical education, has been a kind of crucial touchstone. And I think sort of I was always very much attracted by the kind of synthetic and kind of systemic nature of his approach. And it's like this very deep idea of language as the fundamental aspect of humanity and of society. But also, in addition to having that kind of systemic vision, his ability to really sort of say substantive things about contemporary political developments and to act as a kind of critic and to almost apply that kind of very deep systemic vision to kind of very particular political issues. And I found that very attractive and, at least for me, very, very fruitful. So that was really kind of my experience and sort of, what really drove me to write this book. And as anyone who picks up the book will see if you read in the preface, I mean, what was amazing for me as well as academics, right? We love to study individual thinkers, especially people like me who see themselves as intellectual historians. But I was actually very fortunate. Most of the time, if you study Locke or Hobbes or even Hannah Arendt, who is one of my other primary interlocutors, those people are all dead, and now Habermas is too. But I was very fortunate to actually be able to meet and speak to and discuss a lot of these issues with one of my philosophical heroes. And I think that is such a rare experience to have, since most of the people we study are dead. And so, yeah, I mean, I think sort of it's been a real journey, but I've always been able to take quite a lot from Habermas. And I think he's really helped me to understand kind of a lot of the key philosophical or the key political changes that are occurring in my world around me. And so I think that's really what I've found to be very productive in his work.
It was very important for me to find someone for this episode that could present Habermas, really present Habermas, present all of his arguments, present his life in a very I don't want to say the word authentic, but maybe authentic way. Also, for all the viewers listening, Jürgen Habermas, public intellectual and engaged critical theorist from Columbia University Press, is out right now. I highly recommend buy it or purchase it or ask your university library to bring it in to check it out. I can't wait to read it. I can't thank you enough for all of this and for giving us all this really rich material. And thank you so much for participating in this series.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about Habermas and to really lay out sort of what I think he can continue to teach us even after his death.